Hey there everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how to make this beautiful sourdough rye bread using those three ingredients you saw right above, just organic rye flour, distilled water, and the starter we previously made. This recipe is approved for anyone on the Gerson therapy, but honestly it's so tasty everyone can have. So to get started, we're going to need to get that organic rye starter that we made previously with just rye flour and distilled water. We are going to use 200 grams of that. This will use up the majority of the starter, but don't worry, there'll be just enough left over to get that new starter going. So now we're going to add 275 grams of distilled water to our starter. You're going to want to mix this up until it gets nice and super foamy like you see there. After your water and starter is mixed well, we're going to add 390 grams of organic rye flour. That's all that's going to go in there. Now that we have all of our ingredients in a bowl, which is 200 grams of starter, 275 grams of distilled water, and 390 grams of organic rye flour, we're going to give it all a mix. As you're mixing everything together, I'm sure your first thought is going to be, oh, this looks a little dry, I should add some water. Trust me, don't do it. Just keep on mixing. It will come together and eventually turn into a sticky consistency. Working with rye flour is always a little tricky because you go from a super dry dough to a very sticky dough. The easy trick for that is wet your hands with warm water and continue kneading so nothing sticks on you. So as I said, you do want to continue to wet your hands through the kneading process. And one thing I do want to mention about working with rye only is, when I'm making my traditional sourdough bread, where it might be a white mixed with wheat or white with rye, I do follow a no knead process. But with this one, I do think that you need to knead the dough for 5 to 10 minutes until it becomes much smoother and softer. After about 5 minutes of kneading the rye dough, you should come to this smooth consistency so it's not sticking all over your hands. Once you reach this stage, you do want to give it a 20-minute rest. At that 20-minute rest marker, we'll give it a few more minutes of kneading, and then it's time to proof it on the countertop. While your dough is resting, this is a good opportunity to go ahead and feed your starter before you put everything away. Remember, the feed on this will be equal parts water and rye flour, which is 100 grams of each. After that 20-minute rest period, we're going to knead the dough for a few more minutes here. During this stage, you should notice that it has a softer and smoother feeling to it. If you're new to making sourdough breads, or basically, I guess, any breads using a starter, the most important thing you want to remember is you need time and you cannot rush the process. This little guy is going to require at least a proofing period of 12 to 24 hours. Okay, before you turn the video off and you say, okay, just bread making is not for me, just trust me. Sourdough bread made fresh at home is just like none other. You will just be in heaven when you eat that piece of bread. I know for us on the Gerson therapy, your schedule is already so packed and you're busy with all of your other protocol items. But, honestly, the prep time is minimal here. Like I did mention, it's really just going to need that long period to rest in your fridge or rest on your countertop. So if you plan accordingly, it will work out perfect here. To finish up that second knead, you do want to roll your dough into a nice firm little ball, and then we're going to cover it here and let it rest for another 2 to 3 hours. After 2 to 3 hours of resting, let's see what we have here. Look at that. That little guy already has a nice rise going on. Okay, so now at this point, we want to move the dough over into a proofing container. You can really use any container. Just make sure you flour it heavily with your organic rye flour. This is to prevent any sticking when you need to turn it over, and get ready to bake. So remember, as I mentioned before, you want to heavily flour your dough before putting it in your proofing container. Don't make the mistake I did in the beginning. I would be like, boy, this is too much. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to take some off. And then guess what? Next morning, I couldn't get that little guy out of the container. Before I move it to the fridge, I do like to cover it with some plastic wrap. This is just going to trap in any of the moisture. You don't need to do this stage. You can just cover it here with the cloth cover, but I do like to capture the moisture. So it is the next morning. My dough has rested in the refrigerator overnight. I'm going to take it out here a few hours before I bake it just to get it up to room temperature. You never want to go from refrigerator to baking instantly. You do want this guy to, like I said, come up to room temperature. When making bread, you do want to bake at high temperatures. So, we're going to preheat the oven to 110 degrees Fahrenheit here. We also want to cook the bread in a container so that it captures the moisture during that first 20 minutes of baking. You can use anything that is oven proof that you can move your bread into, but you do want to preheat that container with your oven preheat. Now that the dough has come to room temperature, it's time to get this guy in the oven. I found over the years that the easiest way to get it from the countertop into the oven, into that warm container, is to just use parchment tape paper. So we're going to dump that out here on the parchment paper, give it a little push and smack to get it out of there, and let's see, whoop, it worked. I am not a super big fan of the burnt or the cooked flour on top, so I like to brush off any of the excess flour. This is just personal preference of mine. You do not need to do this. To add a little extra moisture to the bread cooking process and some steam in the initial stages, I like to spritz a little bit of distilled water over the paper and the bread. So now we're going to move this into the oven, into our warm container, and cook for 20 minutes at 510 degrees. After 20 minutes of baking, we're going to go ahead and remove the lid from our baking container. This is so that our bread can form the beautiful sourdough crust. We're also going to reduce the temperature on the oven to about 480 degrees Fahrenheit and bake for another 25 minutes. So I promise just one more step before we can cut into this beautiful loaf of sourdough rye. We're going to want to move it to a cooling rack to let this rest for a few hours before we slice into it. Rye bread is really best cool and after a few hours of resting. Some folks say it's even better the next day. The moment everyone's been waiting for. It is finally time to slice into that loaf. Well, there you go, everybody. We finished our freshly made organic rye sourdough bread. Oh, it's the best thing in the world. I love to serve mine with a little bit of bruschetta here, chopped tomatoes, garlic, some parsley, a little bit of flax oil, and balsamic vinegar. Yum. Enjoy.